Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everybody. Welcome to the IFPRI AMIS seminar series, the latest in this seminar series. We're going to talk about Ukraine 1 year later and the impact of the war on agricultural markets and food security. And this is an event co-organized by IFPRI and the Agricultural Market Information Systems, AMIS. And we find ourselves out one year from the start of the war in Ukraine. And we had an event on the heels of the beginning of the war of Ukraine. And I think that as things have evolved, we continue to see impacts of this event. And that's an understatement of what we're dealing with, this war in Ukraine, and see its impact on global food consumers and agricultural production around the world. I'm going to be a little bit circumscribed in my comments today because I am Seth Meyer. I am the AMIS chair, but I'm also Seth Meyer, chief economist at USDA. And today is report day at USDA. So I won't ask any questions because I wouldn't want anyone to think that while my crew is in lockup, that my questions at all pertain to today's release of the report. But we've got a really great program for you all today. We've got 4 fantastic speakers, and then we'll have a dialogue under our usual format. And so as we go through, though, I would normally interject lots of questions, but as always, we want to hear from you all, and we want to hear from your questions. So to participate in our Q&A session, submit your questions on ifpri.org, Facebook, LinkedIn, YouTube, or by using the hashtag AskIFPRI on Twitter. So please give us your questions as we move into the question and answer session. I think we've got a great set of speakers, so I don't think we'll have any problem having a lively discussion amongst the panelists and questions from the audience. So we're going to kick it right off and get straight into our panelists because I think they've got great information. And our first is Nikolai Gorbachev, president of the Ukrainian Grain Association. And he was one of our guests 1 year ago. So I'm very much looking forward to your comments, Nikolai.
Okay. Hello, everybody. Thanks, Seth, for the introduction. Thanks, AMIS, for organizing such a good event. I would like to represent myself. My name is Nikolai Gorbachev, and I've got experience on agriculture about 30 years, and I'm working for one of the biggest French company as exporter of the grain. On the same time, I am president of Ukrainian Grain Association. Ukrainian Grain Association is a public organization, and about 90% from total grain export done by our members. On the same time, we've got through our members a company which grows grain, which operate and own inland silo and port silo. That's why we can give easily any expertise on agricultural market. Today, I would like to share my view, what we've got after 1 year, and what will happen on the future. It's first slide, and you can see the fields on Ukraine, which now we've got around the whole country. I would like to say that about 4,000 kilometers it's front line, and of course about 30-50 kilometers from the both sides. It's just impossible to walk for any farmers. And we've got situation even worse because about 20-25% from all these bombs and mine, it didn't explode yet. And farmers, before they will go to the field, they have to demine this. I remember when I used to be kids, and I went to my granny, and we tried to find some bombs or other weapons from the Second World War. I think in Ukraine we'll have this situation for the long period of time. Okay. In this case, this is my lovely slide. You can see that red line is production of the grain in Ukraine, and the green column is export. And if 20 years ago we produced about 42 million ton grain and oilseeds, our exports from Ukraine was about 9.5 million. Before the war, we grow 106 million ton grain and oilseeds, and our potential export was about 70 million ton grain and oilseeds. But unfortunately, began 1 year ago, and we didn't complete our export program, and our export on the past season reached just 53.5 million ton grain and oil seeds. It's without oils and without sunflower seeds meal and soy meals. In this year, we have a decrease in production of grain, about 72 million ton, and our export expectation until the end of this season, it's until the end of June, about 51 million ton. But for the next crop, we expect production about 65 million ton. And I would say that decision from all members of Ukrainian Grain Association, it's quite optimistic. And it's quite possible that we will produce for 10 million tons less. But even with this production of grain, and even with this potential export, I'm not sure we will be able to export all this volume. And the question will be how the grain corridor will work. Grain corridor now work not so good. Okay, I think now you cannot see my screen, yeah?
Yeah,
Yes.
they're moving the slides, Nikolai, for you. So you have to say next slide when you want to go on to the next one.
Ah, okay, sorry. And as you can see that our grain production will be less, and export, of course, will be less. No problem with national security. National security is not a problem for us because Ukraine used for domestic consumption, for example, on wheat about 3.5 million ton, and our production should be in this season about 17 million ton, and before the war we produced 33 million ton. The same situation with the feed consumption, especially now when about 6 million people just left Ukraine and live mostly in European country. By the way, thanks to all Europeans that you help to our women and kids just to feel free to go to the school and just to stay there. But what I think that farmers start to think what will they do on the future, because for the next campaign, if they will just grow wheat and corn, they will become to the bankruptcy. For example, production of 1 ton of wheat in Ukraine, break even price cost is about $180 per ton. But when farmers start to sell this grain, they can sell it about 150, 160. I would like to remind that in Ukraine, any farmers can get any subsidies. That's why they have to make their operation only with profit. If they grow at 180, they have to sell at least 180. It will be zero profit, but it will not be losses. For the moment, price for the logistic increase in 3-4 times. If before our export was about 98% through our ports, seaports, and we export mostly to Europe, to Africa, to Asia by vessels. Domestic delivery was about $30-35 for the moment. If farmers would like to send grain to Constanta port, for example, in Romania, or to Gdynia port in Poland, they will spend in 3-4 times more. They will spend about $120-130 per ton. But a few months ago, it was even higher price. Before they spent about $30-35. Of course, with such price as 320 for the moment, for example, on wheat on FOB basis, minus 120, it's $200, minus FOBN, minus other certification, it will be definitely lower price than break even. Can we have next slide, please? Okay, you can see on this slide that our export was quite good before the war. It's blue line, and we export even more than 7 million tons per month. But unfortunately, after the war, we lost the opportunity to export our grain through the port sea. That's why we start to use alternative way. Alternative way, I mean, we start to export by trucks and by railway, and we start to use Danube river ports. We improve the situation, and for the moment we can export on this three variant about 2.5–3 million tons per month. On the same time, the grain corridor, which give to us opportunity to export from our Black Sea, we are happy to get this opportunity. We export there main volume, and for the moment we export about 3 up to 4 million tons only through the grain corridor. The rest we export on alternative way. Alternative way more expensive than grain corridor, but grain corridor has a huge disadvantage. It's unpredictability. First of all, when you will get the vessel. Sometimes vessels are waiting on a queue about 40–50 days because Russia, they just block our check-in vessel. They just decrease number of teams of check-in, and all exporters pay damages from $30 up to $40 per ton on each vessel. Can I have next slide, please? We've got a proposal what we have to do with this, but unfortunately no decision for the moment. By the way, today the General Secretary of United Nations, Mr. Guterres, he had a negotiation with our President Zelensky, and I hope we will find the solution how to continue to export through the grain corridor. I will remind that previous memorandum signed and work until the 18th of March. And since 19th of March, this grain deal can be cancelled. But I am quite optimistic, and I hope the decision will be made and we will sign this agreement, and Ukraine will continue to export. On the next crop, we'll have less export program, and even without grain corridor, we will be able technically to export this grain from Ukraine. For the moment, the biggest buyer from Ukraine, it's China, and on the second place, it's Spain, but about 25% it's African country. The rest, it's around the world. But in any case, before we export grain more than 100 countries. For the moment, we just cut it from the sea, and we've got difficulties. Okay, on the principle, that's it. I will be happy to answer on any of your question. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you very much, Nikolai. Next up, I want to when we first had this discussion a year ago, we focused a lot on grain impacts and grain trade impacts. And, you know, Turkey, obviously an important importer and processor in the region. Turkey is also facing its own humanitarian tragedy going on right now. So I think we want to give Aaron Gunham Ulusoy, Director of the International Association of Operative Millers of the Eurasian region, a chance to talk to us about Turkey's role in the region and also the effects of the tragic earthquake going on in the region. Thank you, Aaron. The floor is yours.
Thank you, dear Seth. Hello to everybody. Thanks to AMIS for making this organization. I am the director for REM International Operative Millers, Eurasia region. I'm from my professional work is a miller in Turkey. As you mentioned, Turkey is maybe when we look to the wheat ecosystem over the world, we can say it is the third country most affected from the war after Russia and Ukraine, because we are the biggest importers of Russian and Ukrainian wheat before the war. We are dependent, we were dependent on the Black Sea supply of wheat. So the war has serious effects on Turkish grain sector during this last 1 year. So let me share my presentation. I think you can see it. Yes, good to go. Yeah, why Turkey is one of the big importers of the world? Let's start with that. When we look to Turkish grain sector, we see that wheat production is around 20 million tons, but the land wheat produced, the acre, is going down every year from 9.7 to below 7 million hectares in 2020. So we are losing land, but keeping the volume, the production quantity constant with increasing yields. But during the same period, the population increased from 60 million to 85 million. So the wheat import of Turkey rised from almost 0 to almost 9 million tons in 2 decades. So that's why Turkey become one of the biggest, I think, in several years, second or third, after Egypt, China. Turkey stays as the third ranking country. Indonesia, sometimes fourth. So when we look where Turkey make these imports, as I said, Russia is the dominating origin for the Turkish wheat imports. As you see, just in 2010-11 season, it's Russia is 15 because there was Russian export, wheat export ban. Except that season, we see straight 60, 70, 80% of Russian supply Russian wheat arriving to Turkey. And last year's, starting from 16-17 season, we saw that Ukraine had also have an increasing share in Turkish wheat imports. Just before the war, when we look to 21-22 season, it was up to 21%. So these two countries is playing a crucial role in wheat supply chain of Turkey. So what happened after the war? Of course, suddenly during until the grain corridor opening during April, May, June, we saw a shrink in Ukrainian share down to 4% and increasing Russian share. The Ukrainian share shifted to Russia. But after the grain corridor opened, Turkey start to purchase from Ukraine as well, and then we see again 30% shares from Ukrainian supplies. So basically, of course, these are about quantities, but about the prices, I think no need to mention. All of us know that prices has jumped almost twofold. We see up to $500. So it's regardless to say the Russian-Ukrainian war was main reasons for world food prices to see the peaks on 2020. But with grain corridor, we see a very optimistic market nowadays, and prices are back to levels before the war. In the world, when we see that even with the previous year, the total world production and consumption had not big gaps, but when there is this kind of supply chain disruptions, the psychology of market affected a lot, and we see huge price increases through the market. Yeah, grain corridor, Nikolai gave already detailed numbers, but what I want to attract attention is, in the beginning, Spain and Turkey was the leading countries who are importing from the grain corridor during August, September, October. later on we saw Chinese demand came to the picture, especially because of corn harvest, because they are usual regular corn buyers from Ukraine. And then on December, we see that China become the biggest importer from the grain corridor. Spain is following, and Turkey is next. Of course, what I want to explain with this graphic is the effect of the war is when there is a supply disruption in specific country, it is not easy to replace it in quick time. So we see that some more remote countries like China have alternative supplies for the coming months, because as they are remote locations, they go on with longer period contracts, despite close countries like Turkey and Europe countries keep for more close time periods, 1 month, 2 month contracts. So it is hard to switch for the countries which have which are remote to originating countries. So my last slide is about what happened in Turkey, the devastating disaster, the earthquake on 6th of February is of course affecting many parts of many people, civilians, the daily life, and of course also the grain markets. As Seth mentioned, Turkey is the biggest flour exporter of the world with 3 million tons per year, and this is representing a quarter of the whole world market when we think that the total is almost 13 million tons, the world flour market. So Turkey is a wheat importer, but also a processor and a flour exporter, especially supplying to Middle East and Africa, and a regular supplier to WFP for humanitarian aids. So is this supply chain affected? I will say when we look to south of Turkey, the 10 cities affected, it's an important region for Turkey about wheat production, flour processing, but as the wheat flour processing industry has an average utilization rate of 52%, what is stopped, disrupted in that region already compensated by other regions, both for domestic needs, domestic demand, and export demand. And when we look the production number, wheat production number, over 19 million tons of Turkish yearly wheat production, 3.7 million tons is produced in the affected cities. So in this context, there is not yet any statistics declared by the government officials, but as depending on the market information, we expect around 6% of lost on this field because of earthquake effect. And when we look to milling capacity, it is 5 million tons. But as I said, this is the capacity. This is not the utilization. So half of it can be assumed as the utilization in the region. We know that there is 11 milling facility demolished totally, unfortunately, which cannot be workable again, and around 109 of them is affected. The production stopped, but they will recover soon and start the production. So in summary, I will say the Turkish supply to world flour market is continuing, not affected directly from earthquake, but of course this earthquake will have effects, economical, social effects in Turkey for the upcoming years. And lastly, about the grain corridor, the market is already agree, market players or future markets agree that the corridor will be extended. I wish that will be the result for sake of the world industry and of course, especially the consumers. Thank you so much.
All right, thank you, Aaron. I think this is a great addition to our discussion from 1 year ago. I really appreciate. I think it was important for us to expand this to obviously one of the key players in the region and one of the key demands within the region. So, Aaron, thank you very much for that contribution, and our thoughts remain with the Turkish people on this extreme tragedy that the country is facing. And so I think that we're going to carry this theme into our next speaker, and I'm excited about this as well too. That now that we've had a little bit of time from the initial impacts of Ukraine to start broadening and talking about the effects for consumers in the region. So I want to invite Sikandra Kurdi, a research fellow at IFPRI, to talk with us a little bit about the demand side in wheat markets. Sikandra, this is the floor is yours. Oh, but I think you may be muted.
Thank you so much. And I have some slides, which I think should be coming up soon. Okay, perfect. So I'm going to talk about the impacts of the Ukraine war and kind of the turmoil in the wheat markets on Yemen and Egypt, two countries that are among those that are fairly deeply affected, and also places where we have ongoing research programs. The next slide, please. Okay, so we'll start over in Yemen. Next slide. So Yemen has a long history as a rich agricultural producer, but starting in approximately the 1970s, there was a lot of outmigration to work in the neighboring Gulf states, and as well as rapid population growth. So it's become increasingly very heavily dependent on imported wheat. The additional important context is that even before the civil war, there was heavy dependence on wheat, but since 2015, the civil war, we're coming up now on almost 8 years, and that has had very devastating economic effects, particularly in terms of the balance of trade, where now the volume of just the value of total food imports is almost equivalent to the value of all exports. So it's very difficult to finance. Before the Ukraine invasion, already during the civil war, you were seeing that there's heavy dependence on wheat in terms of people's diets. 46% of calories are coming from wheat. And then the graphic here is showing where those wheat are coming from. The first bar is showing wheat's role in calories, and then the orange part is showing the portion that is coming from Ukraine and Russia. So it's a pretty significant volume. The other important background to understanding the impacts of the Ukraine invasion in Yemen is that due to the civil war and also kind of long-term underdevelopment, Yemen's has a very severe humanitarian situation. About 26% of the wheat imports that were coming in were actually coming from the World Food Program for humanitarian distribution. And beyond that, it's basically the private sector. So the government is not very active. It's a very small and kind of fragile government there. Next slide, please. So in terms of what happened with wheat imports to Yemen in the past year, there was initially a shift to importing from India until the export ban, and also from the European Union. There have been some imports now, almost 5 shipments through the Black Sea Initiative. Again, not huge. So it's at the level where they're barely managing to keep up. And there was a huge kind of drawdown of the domestic supply, which hasn't been made up yet. One of the big challenges is that in kind of the global scramble to shift to new importers, importers from Yemen are at a disadvantage because of that ongoing civil war in the country. it means that their costs are a lot higher. Part of that is because of the high price of insurance for commercial shipments. Also, we have high fuel prices and shortages within Yemen, which means that the grain milling is very expensive. And then we have this balance of payments issue where because there's so little net exports, there's been a severe rationing of foreign exchange by the central bank. And then on top of all of that, a lot of banks are a bit hesitant to do business in Yemen because there has been past attempts at doing international financial sanctions, and that's always kind of a persistent threat. Next slide, please. The other part of kind of the background here is the heavy reliance on humanitarian aid. So as of early 2023, the entire country is actually in IPC phase 3 or 4, and the black kind of check marks are showing the governorates where they would have been in a worse phase. So the orange is crisis, red is emergency phase. So these like orange ones are being maintained away from an actual emergency only because of that ongoing food distribution. And the food distribution in Yemen is really extensive. More than half of Yemeni households receive some form of food aid. And this is particularly challenging in the global context these days with the Ukraine crisis, with other kind of the lingering effects still from the COVID-19, that humanitarian funding pressure is even higher than it's been in the past. The World Food Programme was forced to cut the food distribution rations by about half in 2022 to keep up with the same number of beneficiaries, simply because there wasn't enough funding to reach everybody with the standard rations. Next slide, please. So then turning to the household level, there's not a lot of, it's difficult to collect data from Yemen continuously, but looking at data that was collected before the war, kind of just before the war, we see that for poor households, when we talk about the average of like 46% of calories coming from wheat, that's much higher for the households in the poorest quintile, where it's like 71% of calories are coming from wheat, and about 25% of their budget just goes to procuring their calories. And what we saw in our own data collection, comparing pre-conflict to post-conflict, is that as household income falls, households actually end up relying more and more on wheat, and we see actually increases in their spending and even total consumption volume of wheat, simply because it's the cheapest calorie source, and so you're really almost in this kind of giffen good situation where there's nothing else you can substitute into. Another place where you're seeing some of the pressure and effects on the household level is that the small traders are the main channel for distribution of wheat and wheat flour from the ports to village communities in the interior of Yemen. And in the past, a lot of those traders have been a crucial source of credit for small households that find themselves going through a hard time. They're able to buy on credit. About 65% of traders in a recent survey said that they sell on credit, but they can't themselves access credit increasingly. So it's kind of this pressure is propagating through the whole system, from the importers being under pressure to the private small traders, and then reaching the households. And what we've heard most recently in terms of kind of just qualitative reports from focus groups and anecdotal stories is that you see in the last few months, there's really a drop in demand for the normal kind of 50 kg bags of flour, and households are just buying barely enough for what they can get money to buy in small quantities. Okay, next slide. We're switching over to Egypt. Next slide. And Egypt is similar in terms of it's having a very heavy dependence on wheat imports, again, because of rapid population growth, limited land available. And so the increase in imports over the past few decades also have been very concentrated for Russia and Ukraine. Here we have the orange is from Ukraine and the red is from the Russian Federation. In contrast, slight contrast to Yemen, Egypt is more of a middle income country. Wheat is not as kind of all-encompassing in terms of people's dependence on it. It's about 35–39% of caloric intake. And the other really big difference is, unlike Yemen, where it's all about the private sector and the humanitarian system, in Egypt, half of the imports come through the government, which is responsible for supplying subsidized wheat, flour, and bread. Next slide. So the government has maintained this commitment to keeping those subsidized prices of flour and bread at the fixed level, even as the market prices increased. And that was a very high fiscal burden. The total cost of the Temwin subsidy program before the before the Ukraine invasion was like 6% of GDP. And then the government is having to pay that increased difference in the market price and the subsidized price. So it's not the only reason, but it was definitely a major contribution to several rounds of currency devaluation, which happened in the past year. The Egyptian pound value has dropped from 16 EGP to dollar to 30 EGP to dollar today, so almost 100% devaluation. And so the impacts for on the household level is felt across the board in all of that inflation. You're seeing here in the graphic the food inflation rates over time for different food categories. The leading one is for bread and cereals, the non-subsidized versions. But then you see it's kind of affecting all of the other food items, from meat to fish to milk to eggs to vegetables even. Next slide. So to be a little bit more specific about the subsidy system, it's in one sense, it's a lifeline for the households, because the large majority, around 80% of households, benefit from the ration card subsidy system, which gives them 5 loaves of beledi bread per day. This is actually a nice photo because you can actually see what a loaf of beledi bread is. And there's a subsidized price that, as I mentioned, it's been fixed over time by the government. Before it was about 10% of the market price. Now, after kind of the wheat prices went up and then the devaluation of the currency, it's about 5% of the market price. So on the one hand, it's a lifeline for the households. On the other hand, it has shifted household consumption very much to depend heavily on wheat and the other subsidized food items. Some of my IFPRI colleagues have done research showing that having access to the ration card is associated with more consumption of the subsidized, basically it's the bread is the biggest one, then it's also oil, sugar, and rice, and less consumption of more diverse, nutritious foods. And it's a problem in a country unlike Yemen, where there's kind of just a problem of undernutrition. Egypt has a double burden problem. So you see both stunting, which is undernutrition, and obesity, very high obesity rates, which is overnutrition. Next slide. And so wrapping up here, we're coming kind of back from the household's perspective. Now in Egypt, we've done some survey data going back to follow up with poor and near poor households that we talked to in January 2022, to talk to them again in October 2022 and ask them what's changed over time. The majority of them are reporting decreases in animal source proteins, very much in meat and eggs. So this is kind of the graphic. The red is the proportion of households showing decreased consumption. There's a few that are increasing consumption, but you can kind of see that this is in the things that people might be substituting towards. So the highest value food items, they're dropping out of people's diets. We also asked in general about what coping strategies households has used to deal with the inflation in the past year. And the leading ones were to stop repaying debt, eating lower quality food. And there's actually quite a substantial share, about half of the households said that they're actually eating less food, which is surprising in a context like Egypt, which is a middle income country. As well as reducing spending on healthcare. So there's, in spite of the government's protection of households' ability to consume wheat, there's definitely some very negative impacts on their resilience and the nutrition of their diet. Thank you.
And thank you, Sikandra. I really like now we brought this from Ukrainian production all the way down to some of the all the way over to some of the most vulnerable consumers that may rely on the global wheat market and Ukraine and Russian wheat markets. So I think this is a great addition. I think we've kind of covered from origin to destination in that source. And so next we're going to go to David Laborde, Division Director at the Food and Agricultural Organization of the United Nations. And David, you got kind of a big job here because you got to kind of tie these three great presentations on this string into a broader look. So I'm going to hand the floor over to you.
Thank you, Seth, and thank you everyone for being with us today. And thank you for the great job of the other presenters already to cover some of the fundamental driver that I'm going to obviously discuss also, but from, in some cases, I would say a global perspective. And actually, I'm going to also discuss some of, on top of the tragedy of the war and other events that have occurred in the last few months, some policy responses that still make things worse when the world faces a problem. We still see uncooperative policies, and I'm going to talk about trade restriction. And let me start by, of course, talking about prices. And during my presentation, I will go back and forth between prices, policies, and of course, food security outcome or linkages, at least at the end. And yes, we were already, since the COVID-19 recession on an upward trend for energy products, for grains, for fertilizer. Some of the restriction, including on some commodity like fertilizer, including in the late 2021, were starting to create some shortages on world markets. And obviously the invasion of Ukraine that you can see with a vertical red line here has accelerated some of the trend observed in the last few months, both on the energy markets due to the geopolitical implication of the war, but also with on the grain market based on everything we have discussed. Now, since the war that is unfinished, but since the beginning of the war at least, we have started to see prices going down, mainly because markets have adjusted in a number of places, but also people have seen that, let's say, for example, the Chinese demand on energy product has shifted largely to Russia. So there was no major shortage on the global market when countries have started to redistribute their demand and their supply. But while the energy prices have declined, also because now we are leaving the winter in the northern hemisphere, so some of the demand of energy is going down. Actually, the price of grains have been relatively stable since August. Sometimes they go up, sometimes they go down. And that's a very different situation, for example, from the vegetable oil market, where we have seen large decrease over the last year. So just to say that even if people say today, okay, prices are going down, they are going down from a very high level, and all prices are not going down. Just want to raise this. But still, the spike in the volatility has made people worried, and in many cases for good reason. And just if I want to zoom in on the last 14 months and for some commodities, yes, you see how starting in February, March, we see the price spike. Then during the summer, also because there was good news on some harvest, some prices went down. But since then, we don't have seen any major decrease. We have seen when the UN grain deal was under threat in November, typically the price of wheat started to increase even by 5% just on a couple of days. So meaning that markets are still observing really what can influence the supply in various regions. And for a commodity like soybean, we see prices going up again. And so the food markets and the feed markets are still tense. So that's what about prices. Now, the question is how people react to these prices, and in particular, policymakers. And what we tend to see is the use of export restriction. So on this slide, you will see the level of export restriction on the left-hand side expressed as a share of the global market of calories, and actually for 3 crises, if you want, the food price crisis of 2008, the 2022 situation, and what did happen in 2020 when the COVID-19 pandemic exploded. And on the right-hand side, you see the number of countries. So here you see that first, in terms of magnitude, the type of restriction we have seen during the first semester of this year, so mainly during the second quarter, where as I would say extreme that during the food price crisis of 2007, 2008, and in particular at the beginning of 2008, when in some cases we have not reached in real terms the same level of prices, but some key exporters have actually implemented restriction. But on the right, and then phase out, but on the right-hand side, you see that the number of countries have also been high and stable. And I think that when we talk about that, we have to think about, yes, there is some restriction on the global markets. And on the global market, what matters is the big players. But there is a lot of smaller countries that also still maintain export restriction today, and that have an impact on the regional markets. You know, so when you are in some case in West Africa, of course you are impacted by what's happened in Ukraine. Of course, you are impacted by the export taxes put in place by Russia, but you are also concerned about what Ghana is going to do. And that's where, you know, you have to combine this to understand all the tension that can occur around the world. Now, here is just what has happened since January 2022 up to now. So on the horizontal axis, you see basically the weeks. You still see the distribution in terms of share of calories. So we still go up to 17% during the spike at the beginning of the second quarter of 2022. But you can see also how the type of commodities that have been impacted evolve over time. We were on a very rising trend on the vegetable oil markets even before the invasion of Ukraine. But of course, Ukraine played an important role on sunflower oil as Russia. But there was a strong dynamic going on Southeast Asia, and the export restriction put in place by Indonesia actually had a global impact and also domino effect on other commodities and other exporters like soybean oil with Argentina and things like that. So we have seen a lot of restriction in the first part of 2022 on vegetable oil. And let's keep in mind that vegetable oil is also part of the staple food of many poor people. You know, when you start to get rice and you start to fry your rice, it's already an improvement in terms of nutrition. And we have seen in countries like Bangladesh also how the cost of importing vegetable oil had increased. But yes, during this 2022 early period of the year, large impact coming from vegetable oil, prices of vegetable oil skyrocketing. At one point, we were at $1,600 per ton of palm oil. So something that people will never thought it will happen. And then after Indonesia stopped to put the export ban, relatively, it relieved a lot of pressure. And what you see now is actually starting with the war, but still today is a number of export restrictions on wheat, and starting with both the drought in South Asia, then the flood in Pakistan, some tension coming on the rice markets. And while, yes, the price of vegetable oil have decreased in the last 16 months, the price of cereals have recessed compared to their spike at the beginning of second quarter of last year, but have stabilized since August. There is one commodity that the price is continually increasing now for nearly 2 years. It's rice, and we are back at the highest price of rice since 2019 now. So just to say, different things, and that's, I think, the commodity to focus really on when we monitor the export restriction, because rice is even a more concentrated market than for other commodities, and still major source of food for the poor people, in particular in Asia, but also in Africa. Now, if I look at the same distribution in terms of countries that implement this restriction, that to some extent mimic some of the commodity, because most of these countries are specialized. Just at the time of invasion, for example, Ukraine was afraid to not have enough food. So as we have seen in many cases around the world, the first reaction of policymakers is, let's keep everything at home. But as our colleagues have shown, the problem for Ukraine was not to keep grains in, it was to get grain out. And quickly after the invasion, Ukraine stopped to put export restriction and was really focusing on that. But just to say, how policymakers in the time of crisis cannot always think about the right solution to their urgent problem. Now we have Russia that maintain relatively high level of export taxes on many commodities. Here I'm focusing on food, but actually it's also the situation on the fertilizer markets. And at the opposite, Indonesia have removed them. So you see, once again, if we think about who we have to focus on, you have basically the policy of 7 countries that over the last 15 years have been always at the core of this issue of export restriction, and what they do and how they implement them is very important. Now, as I've said, how we implement them, just to say that we still face a major issue of transparency. So here and just to say that I am presenting materials, but actually there is a lot of teamwork behind it. There is my colleague at TIFPRI, like Abdullah Mamoun. I am also in some of my slides taking things from Joe. So clearly I am not the one at the core of everything. I'm just the voice for many people working on that. And why we need many people working on that? Because yes, transparency is still not there. So on the left-hand side, you will see normally countries should notify their policies. And unfortunately, we still see a large number of months between notification when it occurs and what's going on. But the main issue is still we have basically only 20%, 17, let's say 20% of the export restriction measures that are notified in the WTO. And that's a major issue, and that's also one of the value addition of AMIS and the consortium. Now, in terms of measure on the right-hand side, you see that half of them are really hard bans, and so they have an impact, when others are about licensing and taxes. And why it matters is I'm going just to get 2 examples. So here you see the exports on Indonesia of palm oil on the left-hand side for 2022 in orange, and for 2021 in blue. And Indonesia put its export restriction in April, and you see how in May export totally collapsed. So very strong impact, immediate impact, and then of course implication for Indonesian producers, smallholders, and the government remove its restriction. On the right-hand side, you see a situation in India, where in May, due to the, so at the beginning of the crisis, India say, we have wheat and we are going to export it. And actually they have done it. But potentially they have done it in a too successful way. So you see how April, for instance, was a very strong month of exports by India. But in May, we start to have the heat wave impacting some Indian states. So the harvest was starting to be revised downward. But even after May, when the export ban were put in place, you still see export flows. So they vary from one month to another, but it's not a hard stop. It's just making things more difficult. And it made things more difficult for some commercial traders, including export going to Yemen, were blocked at the time. And then there was a lot of government-to-government discussion, but obviously it makes markets less efficient. Just because I'm going to conclude, On this graph, I am overlapping the FAO food price index in blue and the share of calorie restricted in yellow. And you see over the year all the overlap, but here it's correlation, it's not causality, because basically they feed each other. When policymakers see prices going up, they tend to put export restriction. But of course, putting export restriction are creating an artificial shortage on world market and accelerate it. And that also think we investigate with various colleagues. But the situation is, yes, each kind of measure sometimes has its own story and political economy behind it. And price sense is part of the story, but other elements can factor in. I'm going to conclude about talking about food security. I just want to say that food security was deteriorating already for years, and basically since 2015, before this crisis. This year in 2022, we had to deal with the three major drivers of food security. So conflict, global, and I would say local. Climate shock, directly linked to climate change. We have 3 years of La Nina on the road. And we know that in some places like Australia, it can need more water and so increase production. And in other places, it means also drought. Today, Argentina is facing very terrible production conditions, for instance. And of course, the economic situation coming from COVID make things difficult. But we have this rising food security structurally, and on top of that, the crisis. But the Ukraine crisis is not the only driver, okay? And I'm not even going to start to do attribution, to start to say, because there is the war in Ukraine, there is 5 million people more or less. All of this come on top together. If this year we have great harvest and economic growth, the impact of the war will be reduced, but at the opposite, if we have bad harvest, things will be much more complicated. And we know also how the war impact the macroeconomic dynamics. And so, you have all of this combination of effects. And just to conclude, just this slide to show, this is among the countries where we have seen the largest number of people that are in near famine situation. And yes, you have some that are directly related to what's happened in the Black Sea in terms of providing food through commercial or humanitarian help, but you have also a lot of situations that are about local conflict. And that's this nexus that still require attention. Thank you.
And thank you, David. I knew you could bring us home, so I had all the confidence that you'd wrap it up that way. I think that's important. We're used to these vagaries of weather, right? But as you know, we've got regional conflict, we've got global economic issues, we've got major conflicts in a producing region in the Black Sea. I think when we have combinations of these things, and when you add conflict that has a very uncertain time horizon, I think, and then layer on top of that other decisions like export restrictions, we start to see this volatility. And I agree with you, if we need good yields around the world in order to reduce some of this volatility. Will we get it? Well, we're used to the vagaries of weather. What other events will we see? Now we're going to move on to the next phase. And this is going to be really difficult for me because, as I said, I'm not going to get to ask any questions. And I thought the speakers have been great. So I'm going to have to pass on. Before we do that, I'm going to remind you all that while we're running these questions, you can submit your questions at ifpri.org, Facebook, LinkedIn, YouTube, or by using hashtag @AskIFPRI on Twitter. Because right after these interventions by Joe and Aaron, they're going to move on with the conversation. So I'm going to hand it over to Joe Glauber, who's Senior Research Fellow at IFPRI and also Secretary for AMIS, and Aaron Collier, who's the Feed and Food Grain Analyst at FAO and also a major contributor to AMIS analysis. So Joe, Aaron, I'm going to hand it on to you.
Great, Seth. Thanks so much. And Aaron and I will kind of do a tag team here. We don't have a lot of time, unfortunately. And I'm sure, like the rest of you, this last hour has been great. I've learned a lot. But so I'm going to start right away with actually one of the questions that has come into the chat, and that's for Nikolai. And Nikolai, the question is one that I've pondered over as well. When you are giving your statistics about what the projections are for 2023-24, and in particular 23 production. Is that, how much of that does that account for production in the occupied areas of Ukraine, or is that largely in the unoccupied area, or in the free sections of Ukraine, where producers are just either deciding not to plant or plant other crops?
Okay, thank you for your question, Joseph. I would like to say that we can see only the plan for the crop only on that territory which Ukraine can control. For the moment, I would like to say about 20% of our territory under Russian control. And before the war, we seen there about 13 million tons of grain. And after harvesting time, they collect additionally 15 million ton. That's why I cannot count and I cannot put in my balance in my supply and demand list this volume of grain, because for me it's lost for the moment, and I cannot control. And as you know, Russia continue to steal grain from the territory of Ukraine, and they start to load it from Crimea, from other ports. That's why our forecast base is only on the territory which we can control.
Yeah, no, thanks very much. That's very helpful. And it is a question that comes up a lot. So thanks for clarifying. I'm going to have one follow-up, Aaron, and then I'm going to turn it over to you. But the follow-up is this, Nikolai. In terms of crop choice, you talked about the fact that all these additional costs for transportation, either going out through the solidarity lanes or even going through the Black Sea because of the demurrage charges and other things, that to a degree those costs are being absorbed in terms of lower prices for Ukraine producers, and that is causing some producers to you said that over the longer run certainly see less grain production. How much is shifting to oil seeds? And can you talk a little about that? And can you also address the issue of what we saw this year is a lot of sunflower seed being exported rather than being crushed in Ukraine and turned into sunflower oil and exported? And if you can just address those two.
Yeah, of course, sure. According to the territory, before the war, we had about 7 million hectare on a wheat. For the moment, it's 3.7. It's nearly in 2 times decrease. In a corn, we had about 5.5 million ton, half million hectares. And for the moment, in our expectation, in the best case, will be about 3.5. My personal opinion, it will be even less. But on rapeseeds, it will be increasing, because rapeseeds, it's a more profitable product for farmers, and it's quite expensive oil seeds, and it's easily to export to farmers directly without any trading houses. They can load 1 truck or a few wagons, and they can send it to the crushers in Europe. That's why we expect that increase in production of rapeseeds for 1 million ton, about 4 million ton in the next campaign instead of 3.5 in this campaign. And for the crushers, of course, for the moment, it's very difficult to operate crushing plant. And as you know, Ukraine is the biggest producer of sunflower seeds oil. But on a technology of production, we use Gexan. It's a special benzene, it's special gasoline, which necessary use. And it's a very dangerous product to use it during the war. That's why about 50% of our crushing plant now blocked. And we export for the moment little bit more than 3 million ton of oil, sunflower seeds oil, since the beginning of the season. Usually on this period of time, we export for 40% more. And it just increase our stocks of sunflower seeds. And I think we will increase export of sunflower seeds to the Europe, but it will be less than I expected 1 year ago, because 1 year ago I expected it will be about 6 million. For the moment, I think it will be about 3.5 million ton altogether for the whole season.
Great. Aaron, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Hey, thanks. I'm going to switch gears a little bit and actually had a question for David, switching to policy restrictions. So, David, we're looking at, in terms of the number of policy restrictions and export restrictions specifically within the wheat market, there seems to be kind of a bigger, higher magnitude of export restrictions in that market. And I think you said that Russia was kind of seemed to have the most, was leading in the export restrictions within the wheat market. It stands out to me a little bit that the big supplies and strong export campaign from Russia recently has been one driver bringing wheat prices down in international markets recently. So I'm just curious if you could speak a little bit to maybe a more nuanced relationship between the type and magnitude of an export restriction, the impact that has on prices. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. I mean, Russia has an exceptional year of production going on. Actually, in 2022, their exports over the year were about at least 15% compared to the previous year. So a lot of wheat went on the markets. Now, they have export taxes, potentially for fiscal purposes, for redistributing the gain. We see the same thing on fertilizer. When there's a lot of export and when prices are high, government wants to capture part of the rent. So it doesn't block the export, but it just still increase the price for consumers and for importing countries. So obviously, Russia's supply contribute to reducing the prices, but the specific policy of the Russian government still contribute to get prices above what they should be based on the overall situation. So that's a nuance. And
okay, great. Joe, I'll turn it back over to you.
Okay, great. So this one, I'd like to maybe probe a little bit more on insofar as Turkey is concerned, because clearly the earthquake has been very devastating on a personal level, on a humanitarian level. Can you, Mr. Ulusoy, can you talk a bit about how much wheat is imported into those the southeastern ports? Do they source some of the wheat for the flour milling sector there from imports, or is it mainly coming from production in that region?
I would say at least a third of the imports is being done with the East Mediterranean ports of Turkey, mainly Iskenderun and Mersin, because the Southeast Asia flour millers is playing role to process the wheat and ship it to Iraq and Syria, which are the two biggest countries for exports. So 1.3 million tons of flour is shipped to Iraq per year, and 350,000 tons of flour shipped to Syria in a regular year. So that chain from wheat converted to flour is affected because the main Iskenderun port is still not operating. Mersin is operating now. So the ones who are continuing to production using Mersin port for their discharging needs and transport needs. So I will say, of course, it's not the millers in the region not just working for export, also for domestic, but exports play a big role as well. So, but up to now, as I mentioned, on general basis, the other regional producers, millers, they try to ship to the destinations for export markets to Iraq and Syria as well when there was disruption in production in the region. So I will say, despite there is these logistical problems in the region, from the destination, we did not hear much complaints about the shipments arrival to there.
Yeah, so just as a follow-up, and just so I make sure I'm understanding, what you said is that overall capacities generally there was some excess capacity for other mills to
In
pick
other
up some
regions,
of that.
yeah.
Yeah, and so ultimately you would say that this will likely have small impacts on imports of wheat and exports of flour. Is that to conclude, or is that, am I right in that, or is this you think this will cause some disruption this year in those numbers?
Yeah, I will expect some lose in the quantity for a couple of months, which I explained to Iraq and Syria that may be affected up to 20-30% monthly. Yeah, that's it's not just location. Of course, there is trade relations between these importers in the destination, exporters in the origin in Turkey. So it will take time to get back in the line. But I will say, yes, a region, there is a region affected hugely. But it's like there are other channels to reach the destination, both in supply of wheat, the discharge port, making production as in the mills, and ship it to the export country, to the destination. So we will say in a yearly figure, we will expect minor effects.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Erin, back to you.
Great, thanks. So for Sikandra, just looking at consumption, I guess, in Egypt. So I know you talked a little bit about some of the consumption patterns shifting to some unsubsidized items, meat, chicken, eggs, milk, I think you mentioned. But, just curious about chances or opportunities for any substitution towards other cereals within Egypt, just given away from wheat. Obviously, wheat is a very important staple there, but given the high cost of continuing to subsidize wheat for the government in Egypt, if they were to have to eventually scale back on the subsidy and prices were higher in wheat, are there other, what is the landscape for other cereals in that situation?
Oh, thanks. Yeah, this is a great question. So Egypt is also a maize producer. So there could be kind of substitution towards maize, but it's not part of people's kind of dietary patterns, and that's something that's fairly resistant to change. Instead, what you're seeing kind of in terms of government more long-term responses, it's not trying to shift people's consumption patterns, but they're trying to increase domestic production. So they have, in addition to intervening on the demand side of the market, the government is also very active on the supply side. They have kind of a wheat procurement system. So one of the things that they have done is that they've raised the procurement prices for wheat to try and expand production within Egypt. So I think that's kind of more likely in terms of a long-term reaction to the high prices for wheat.
Great, thanks. And just a quick follow-up question, Joe, if I may. Moving over to Yemen, just in terms of overall consumption, I know you mentioned that there's some evidence that some households are buying smaller quantities because of the high prices, but also some other poor households seem to be even more reliant on wheat, given the price advantage for them. So overall, the impact of the high prices of wheat, would you say on overall total consumption, is there any dampening effects there, or not yet?
So it's quite difficult to get like really accurate consumption measure at the household level these days, because you have to actually go and collect it from the field. We have some kind of upcoming surveys, so we're hoping that by the time those get to the field, we'll have more information. I mean, overall, the data that is available is from these screening surveys, usually done by telephone, that's asked about the food insecurity level, and that's what kind of the famine classification level is really drawing on. So there, yeah, you see that the situation is worsening in terms of the share of households that are reporting food insecurity.
Great, thanks a lot. Back to you, Joe.
Great. So we have one question from the chat that's come in, and David, I think I'll let you handle this one. But this is a question that comes up, I think, a lot because both in terms of whenever we've seen periods of where we have food spikes and other things, people have talked about, well, shouldn't countries embark on self-sufficiency policies, or shouldn't the world be considered? Shouldn't the world be maintaining large grain reserves? Can you discuss those issues? I realize you could probably write a book on those. People have written books on those issues, but if you could kind of give some quick thoughts on that.
So, yes, I think that we should first keep in mind that we don't know where the next risk or shock will come from. You can be self-sufficient, and if you start to have a war at home, or unfortunately, the situation in North Ethiopia, that's not going to solve your problem to be self-sufficient the previous year. Similarly, due to the weather shock, and that's going to become more and more frequent, we have seen countries like Morocco that have lost 30% of their grain production last year. So there is no one solution that is going to make you protected from every risk, because by definition, there are risks. Some are spatially correlated, some are not spatially correlated, some are global, some are local, and it's only through having markets and market connected that you can start to distribute the risk. So that's at one point sometimes upset people, because when you have a crisis at home and the world markets help you, you are very happy. When you have no problem at home and your neighbor has a problem, and so you import part of this problem, you start to be unhappy. But this is how we have to think that, or we let people manage individually their risk. And if you are lucky and nothing bad happened to you, that's very good. But the day that something happened to you, how we do it collectively, it's like an insurance problem, that's where it matters. Now, of course, we can also say we can all build a mountain of stocks. So like this, we will always be ready for the next year. That's a possibility, but that's also a very costly possibility. We have all this narrative about reducing food losses, for example, and post-harvest losses, while we know that a large part of the post-harvest losses come from the lack of capacity to protect the grain, and that it's complicated to keep grains over years, okay? And even countries that have large public stock programs, they face this issue, when there is excess, you start to store things unoptimally, and I will say a few years after, you don't know what to do with grain. The first year is good for humans, the second year it may be good for animals, and the third year, you basically ask your chemical complex to try to break down your maize in amino acid with a lot of loss of values, and behind it also a lot of natural resources that have been made. So we have to think that all these options have a cost. They have been tried in the past. And so far, working in a cooperative manner, but also investing in making system more resilient, like at the farm level, getting more drought resistance, things, making the world more peaceful is the way to go, through cooperation and smart investment. Just piling up things or things that each of us will be safer if we lock ourselves in a room may not be on the long run the smartest option, and a bit sad if you think about how human civilization has tried to make some progress over the last 2,000 years.
Thanks, David. Erin?
Thanks. Okay, I'm going to switch back to Nikolai, looking at Ukrainian dynamics. Just looking at your export forecasts. So, for maize has been kind of dominating the export campaign from Ukraine this season so far. But I noticed in your 23-24 forecast, you're expecting a decline in exports of maize, I believe, from the season. Just curious if that's demand driven, or is that more is logistics playing a part in that, or is that supply side for Ukraine in terms of expected reduced production, perhaps? And then for wheat exports, just curious how much Russia's had this very big harvest, has had a really strong export pace recently. Curious how much competition from Russia is playing a part in your wheat exports right now.
Nikolai, you may be muted.
Actually, I think we lost him.
I think we lost him.
Yep. You'll have to move on.
Well, actually, if I may, just sticking with the forecast, kind of the outlook trend for 23-24, just to kick it back quickly to David. Just curious, looking forward to 23-24, do you expect to see kind of the same level of trade restrictions in terms of magnitude and number of countries as we've had this past season?
So it's going to depend a bit about the type of news we have. That if we start to have a couple of bad news in terms of production in some places, in particular on the rice market, I will be worried to see some restriction on the rice market. Now, at the same time, with the experience of Indonesia on palm oil this year, I don't think they will do it again next year. So, for instance, I don't expect to see the same behavior. So I will say that we may see less export restriction in 2023 based on the experience of 2022, but potentially on other specific products. And the fact that, yes, situation in Argentina may have to be looked carefully also, because very bad year, bad supply, and that's a government that can be prompt to implement new ones. But we already know that Argentina will not have a very good year on world market this year, so market may have already anticipated that. I'm stopping here because our colleague is back.
Yeah, Nikolai's back. If you want to restate the question, Aaron.
Sure. Nikolai, were you able to catch the question, or do you want me to repeat it?
Unfortunately, I didn't. It's because we still have some problem with electricity in Ukraine, and I just was cut it, and before my generator started to work, that's why I lost you for 1 minute. Sorry for this.
No problem. No problem at all. I was just asking about, in terms of exports for Ukraine, grain exports, looking forward to the 23-24 season. I guess first I'll start with maize. Maize has kind of dominated the exports coming out of Ukraine for the past this season so far. But I noticed in your 23-24 forecast a slight decline in your expected exports of maize. And I was just curious if that's what are kind of the drivers behind those expectations. Is that logistics? Is that demand driven? If you could speak a little bit to those dynamics.
Yeah, it's true. Ukraine, in any case, will decrease production and, of course, export of maize. It's understandable because it's a very heavy product. For example, the average yield in Ukraine in this season about 6 tons. In the past season, we had 7 tons per hectare. It's big volume of grain, which farmer needs to move somewhere, need more trucks, more wagons, and level of profitability in corn not so good as you can find on other products, for example, on rapeseeds, on linseeds, on sunflower seeds. That's why we expect with barley, by the way. And in this season, we export only about 2 million tons of feed barley. For the next campaign, we expect even less crop and less export of feed barley. But on a wheat, in my opinion, it's no we have no other choice. We cannot decrease everything because farmers, they have to turn products on their fields, and on a winter crop, the best product is wheat. That's why we will continue to produce wheat. But as I said from the beginning, we decrease our planted area from 7 million hectare down to 3.7. It's nearly in 2 times.
Mm-hmm. And actually, just following up on the wheat, you know, for wheat exports from Ukraine, notice the forecast has it staying stable going into next season. Just curious in terms of, you know, Russia's had a very big harvest lately and has a really strong export pace. How much is competition from those exports impacting Ukraine's export campaign?
Oh, for the moment, we do not feel the competition from Russia. We have another problem. For example, we export through the grain corridor, and we pay the demurrage. Of course, this demurrage paid by farmers because all traders just put this price for the logistic price as a logistic price. That's why for us it's the main problem. And now farmers, for example, they can sell their product on FOB basis, milling wheat, about $230 instead of $320 when this product can come to Romania. For example, from Constanta, we can sell for $90 more expensive, but a road to Constanta will be even more expensive than to go to the port. That's why this grain initiative, grain corridor, it's good deal. Of course, it's better than without, but in any case, very high logistic price. We still have very high logistic price.
Okay, I'm sorry to say we've eaten up the half hour for questions. This has been great. Very, very wonderful hour and a half here. So let me first thank the panelists. Again, this was, I really wanted to bring a full view of what's going on, particularly focusing on wheat, but again, with David bringing in some of the other commodities. So thanks so much. Thanks to Aaron and Seth for helping me moderate the panel and do the questions. And thanks to my great production team at IFPRI, Joanna, Chris, and Michael, who have been behind the scenes making this thing work. A couple things, I'll do some shameless promotion. One is I encourage you to go up on the AMIS website. That's amis-outlook.org. You can find a lot of stuff on markets up there that we've been doing now for since 2012 or so. So we're in our 11th year. For more information on what's going on in Ukraine, there's a landing page on the IFPRI website, where it has a lot of blogs by David and myself and others. And Sikandra has helped there. And then lastly, I just want to thank Arnaud Petit, who's not on the program, but Arnaud is the director for the International Grains Council, and he's been behind the scenes helping me organize these things. So a shout out to Arnaud as well. And then lastly, IFPRI does have an event coming up on the 14th called on food loss and waste in the fruit and vegetable supply chain. So if you have a chance, you might want to check that out as well. That's on the IFPRI website. And I think that's all the notes I have of things to remember. But again, sorry we didn't get to all the questions. You can email us or whatever, and we'll try to get back to you. But otherwise, thanks so much for joining. And with that, I'll shut it down.